In this section, I want to connect oil production and oil dependence on conflict. This photo is actually from a 2018 attack on an oil tanker near the Straits of Hormuz that the U.S. blamed on the Iranians. The Straits of Hormuz sees roughly 40% of the world's crude oil flow through its narrow strait between the Arabian Peninsula and Iran. It, along with the Bab el Mandab Strait on the other side, are two choke points for a lot of the world's commerce and oil flowing around the world. And this most essential of natural resources is one that the existing literature suggests is the most dramatically associated with conflict. So I wanted to spend a bit of time looking at the specific mechanisms connecting oil and conflict. This is this brings back memories for me. This picture, I actually was in a previous life working on a sailboat that was repositioning from Cyprus down to Kenya about 20 years ago now. And we sailed through the Bab el Mandab Straits at night. It's only about 26 kilometers wide, and it is one of the scariest moments of my life, having to try to navigate a 60-foot sailboat along with all these absolutely huge boats sailing around the world. When we finally made it around through the Bab el Mandab Strait, we landed in Aden, a port in Yemen, a couple of weeks after the USS Cole had been bombed. One of the attacks Al-Qaeda carried out against U.S. forces that is now relatively forgotten, but along with the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam were the most dramatic examples of terrorism for the United States before 9/11. And when we pulled into Aden, you could see the coal had been removed by then, but the press reports were there, and you could see other boats that had been attacked in that area. So it's a sobering reminder of geography, the accidents of history, and the choke points in the globalized system that we all kind of depend on, including in 2020 with the shortages of toilet paper and other dry goods, brings home just how the possibility of disruption that conflict, pandemics, other kinds of natural disasters can have on our day-to-day lives. So I wanted to talk a bit about the negative effects that oil can have on democracy, institutions, and conflict. The Ross literature review that we read for this week was really good at highlighting the main takeaways from the literature. And he finds, as the literature does generally, that oil dependence is one of the most robust predictors of what type of political regime you have, that oil production is correlated with a lack of democracy. It's also a predictor for regime stability, that if you're not a democracy, you're more likely to stay at whatever regime type you have, as well as if you are an oil producer in a democracy, that can also help as well. But the literature that we read for today focuses on regime stability in autocratic states, how oil can be crucial for that as well. I have to work Brunei into this lecture at some point, because it's another one of those natural resource producing states that's been incredibly stable. The other main effect that oil has on political institutions is that it increases corruption because of those natural resource rents that I talked about in the last section, and the potential to turn into a rentier state in which the country becomes dependent on these resources and less dependent on the support of the citizenry within the country, as well as the incentives for international corporations to do what they need to do to be able to get secured access to resources within a government. These corporations often have to make deals with less savory governments and to work where the oil is, not necessarily where they might like to work. And so, corruption has been an endemic issue in the oil industry. However, as we're going to see in one of the later sections, it's a subject of an effort at trying to bring transparency with the EITI initiative that we're going to look at in a second. A quick kind of graph or timeline showing how oil and oil price and conflict can be quite related from the 78, 79 when the new government took over in Iran. There was a period of disruption that led to price spikes. The Arab Spring also was associated with a price spike in 2011. That any kind of political instability or uncertainty about production can lead to price spikes as people want to try to secure what resources they can ahead of any potential disruption. This can be through purposeful attacks, like this Wall Street Journal article talking about attacks on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia last year. Nigeria is another area in which people have periodically attacked. I mean, the Saudi attack, there was evidence that it came from abroad, but with Nigeria and others, people try to siphon oil off, steal the oil, or disrupt oil supplies through attacks for political gains. Saudi Arabia, one of the world's largest producers of oil, any kind of disruption there can lead to spikes in prices. And I think Saudi Arabia is an example of a country that was completely transformed by the increasing need and national security implications of oil around the world since the 1930s, but then they're also at the forefront of trying to diversify, as with a couple of other Gulf states, away from the dependence on oil. And so I think it was really amazing last year when Saudi Arabia said that they would open up the kingdom to foreign tourists. So that was on the 27th. The attacks on the oil facilities were on the 25th. So draw your own conclusions about the proximity of these two things. I think as someone who's always wanted to go to Saudi Arabia, a lot of Americans that I know have spent time working there. You can get work visas, and there were military bases, U.S. military bases there for a while. But tourism, since the time of Sir Richard Francis Burton, has been a no-go for non-Muslims. And now I'm not sure the extent that COVID has had an effect on it, but it's an indication of how Saudi Arabia and other countries are trying to diversify away from that dependence on one particular resource. These resources also can buy a lot of state capacity. As I mentioned in the previous section, this is also typified by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, as the biggest oil-dependent state, is one in which the implications for a lot of these things are the most dramatic. I remember a couple of years ago when the U.S., President Trump heralded arms deals with Saudi Arabia. The U.S. has been one of the largest suppliers of weaponry to Saudi Arabia for decades. In 2017, within the first year of President Trump being in office, he signed a deal worth up to $350 billion US to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia has been using these arms not necessarily always just to protect themselves against regional competitors in the Middle East, but also in the political affairs of neighboring states, in this case specifically Yemen. Saudi Arabia, is definitely the largest arms purchaser in the region. They don't just purchase arms from the U.S., they also purchase arms from other countries, of course, Egypt and others also buying a large amount of weapons. And the size and scale of their production can give them market control. OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Companies, was an organization created during those kind of time period of oil disruption and price shocks in the 1970s as an effort to try to bring stability to the market and to limit supply in order to keep prices at a more regular level because of those the implications for the bottom line for price instability. However, you can see it can be used as a foreign policy tool, deciding to flood the market or increase exports, as this article suggests just from last month, that they can have an effect on oil prices by increasing production. And so that gives market power as well as foreign policy influence that can allow the leadership some leeway to behave in some anti-democratic ways, including the case a couple of years ago with the assassination in a Turkish embassy of a well-known Saudi journalist who was then living in the United States, traveled to the embassy in Turkey in order to try to get a wedding permit, and ended up being killed and cut up back a couple of years ago. This led to questioning the Crown Prince's leadership in Saudi Arabia in foreign capitals, as well as a questioning of the openness and the commitment to transforming the Saudi society that the Crown Prince had been talking about ever since he had become on the ascendant and been the heir apparent. And also, this power, economic power, can lead to involvement in conflicts. Given the amount of weaponry and capacity and influence that large exporters have, the Saudis have been engaging in the ongoing battle in Yemen that broke out after indirectly after a number of steps and after the president stepped down in Yemen after 2011, and the Saudis have been criticized for their involvement, as well as the United States for helping sell them the weapons when there's evidence that the Saudis have been using them on civilians in Yemen. This is just a raid on the Houthis just in the last couple weeks as well. And yeah, there's concerns that the implications for the U.S. For what the Saudis have done are more real, given the push towards a responsibility to protect and trying to hold accountable the people who are a step removed from the direct attacks during conflicts and the violations of human rights in the last 20 years or so. So yeah, you see Saudi Arabia here. The dramatic relationship between democracy and oil income can be seen by those cases in the red box here. You see Saudi Arabia had one of the largest oil incomes per capita, only is exceeded by Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, while the time under democratic rule hovers there exactly at zero. And so people have made an argument that because of the resources that oil production allows, the ability to avoid pressure to democratize is quite strong. That authoritarian states are stable if they can depend on those resources, as well as be able to protect against the rainy days when the price fluctuates. Overall, oil-producing countries, as you can see from this graph, compared to all countries, are substantially less likely to be democratic than all other countries in the world, going back since 1945. This changes the polity score to out of 100, but you can see that the blue line, the oil producers, are always lower than other countries, and it seems to move in tandem, the oil-producing countries and the other countries. And you can see the swings that we saw in the previous section, that these swings can occur quite dramatically. And so it's a product on stability potentially being a good thing. And I think since Gaddafi fell in Libya after the multilateral assistance to the rebels in Libya in 2011, 2012, is an example of the difficulty when trying to make foreign policy or to try to look at political institutions, what weight the rest of the world plays on stability versus democracy. And the Libya now is basically broken into two major pieces. There hasn't been a consolidated government. Same with Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003. The first George Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, from 1989 to 1993, during the first Iraq War, on purpose decided not to proceed all the way to Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein, despite the human rights violations against his own cities, against his own citizens in the 1980s, because of the worry about instability after removing the leader. After George W. Bush, the Iraq invasion in 2003, there has been relative stability in recent years, but nothing like the absolute autocratic lid that in place on any kind of dissent that occurred before he was removed from power. And so with a lot of these stable states, with these kind of price fluctuations, if governments can maintain the military control, the source of funding to be able to pay for the military as well as provide for citizens, then that can provide some stability. And so oil can lead to conflict in order to try to control that region, like in Cabinda in Angola, but it can also potentially have this ability to try to lead to stability. And so the Ross article goes through a whole bunch of different mechanisms about the greed and grievance, reasons for why oil would be associated with conflict, and there's nothing like having this fungible source of private rents that can provide an attraction for either elites, competing groups, or for foreign interests to try to provide the resources to be able to change a government within a state. And so oil is one of those largest predictors of both autocratic stability as well as conflict. And so I think for me, when I think about oil, it can become quite abstract, but then it's also one of those commodities that most Australians are familiar with the fluctuations in price over time, in part because it is one of the only goods that we buy that we just go and do that and get it and pay for it and then move on. I can't think of any other resource unless you have to run to the store for milk or something, but it's something that we all have a realistic idea about what the prices are. Everyone here in Canberra complains about how much more we spend for gas than people on the coast, and it is one of those things that we've become quite price sensitive for. I think also it's interesting to stress in Australia, as opposed to the US now that is a net exporter of oil, is Australia's capacity for refining has gone down quite dramatically over time, and Australia has become more dependent on international sources of oil over time. We maintain I think a 30-day reserve, but it is subject to the kind of destruction and disruption that could occur if anything again happens in the Strait of Hormuz, if there's a regional war in the Middle East or in the South China Sea. That can make it a lot harder for us to kind of get out of Canberra, head to the coast or something on these kind of long weekends. And so for me, I wanted to, with the third lecture question, I wanted to try to link it to your own lives. Do you know where the petrol that we use comes from? I found an article that I think it provides an interesting perspective, and it's brief. So if you can Google where does Australia's oil come from, it leads you to this. It's a little bit more fun than just giving you the link and ask you to click it, because there's also a couple of other things there in the results there that are interesting. There's an article by Anthony Richardson in The Conversation talking about Australia's vulnerability for disruption and the risk that comes from having to depend on an international source of resources. And so take a look at that, and I'd be interested to get you to respond to the first question: had you thought about the potential for oil supply disruption in Australia? During the in March and April, you heard people making a run for toilet paper. You saw people make a run for pasta and rice and other kind of staples, but you didn't see people lining up for gas in the same way as people did in the 1970s. Was there Why don't you think that there was a worry about gas disruption? Because in the conversation article, it shows that the amount of buffering capacity that gas stations have is actually substantially less than grocery stores have for those kind of things that people made a run for. Is this something, the second question, do you think this is something that Australia needs to worry about? And if so, why? And if not, why? This is not something that gets talked about that much, but in the aftermath of the current pandemic, is the globalized system, the just-on-time arrival of petrol as well as other resources, something that could provide some worry for national security risks in developed states like Australia, but even more so in developing states. As we're going to see with the South Sudanese case, you can have a country that produces a lot of resources, but that is really hard to actually get that same resource within the country. Saudi Arabia has reduced subsidies for gas in recent years within the kingdom, but it was ludicrously cheap as recently as a decade, 15 years ago, as a way to provide services for Saudi citizens within the country. So yeah, take a quick break, answer that, and then watch the videos about the South Sudanese case. There's 3 videos. The 2 are part of the same documentary, and then we can talk about the South Sudanese case, in which you have a country that's hugely, as we saw with the graphs, hugely reliant on natural resource extraction, as well as suffering through an ongoing conflict and a series of decades of conflict. So we're going to be talking more about the relationship between oil and conflict in that case, and also later on in the international responses. So go quick answer on Waddle, and we'll come back and start talking about Sudan.